All right, folks, welcome to the Kashmir Palestine Conversation Series, the latest episode of which will be addressing the question of, or the issue of poetry and literature, Palestinian and Kashmiri. Very much looking forward to today's event. We have a great lineup of speakers. I won't be presenting them, but I do want to say that my name is Tawfiq Haddad. I'm the director of the Council for British Research in the Levant's Kenyan Institute. I'm broadcasting here from Jerusalem, but folks online today, our panelists are coming from the United States, from Ramallah, and different parts of the globe. So very much looking forward to it. Today we have, our event is going to be moderated by Dr. Nadine El-Enany. She's a reader at law at Birkbeck School of Law and the co-director of the Center for Research on Race and Law. She teaches and researches in the field of migration and refugee law, European Union law, protest and criminal justice. The rest of her bio can be seen on our website. I'm sure you've seen it, but I want to, before we hand things over to Nadine, I'm going to pass it over to my colleague, Emma Brandlund, who is also one of the founders of the Kashmir Palestine Conversation Series and the Kashmir Palestine Scholars Network that is putting this on together.
Thank you, Tawfiq, and thank you everyone for joining us this afternoon. I just wanted to quickly welcome you all to the fourth Kashmir Palestine conversation that we're having. We're delighted to have Nadine El-Enany as a chair for today's event and Dalia Taha and Ather Zia as our speakers. So without further ado, I will hand over to Nadine to introduce our speakers. So thank you so much for joining us, and I hope you will enjoy this talk.
Thanks, Emma, and thanks, Tawfiq, for inviting me to facilitate this session. And I'm really delighted to be sharing the space with all of you, and especially our speakers, Dalia and Ather, and all of you who are joining us today. I thought I'd start with a few words that I was inspired to put together in response to this really important conversation that Emma and Tawfiq have put together today on Kashmiri and Palestinian poetry and literature. After that, I will briefly introduce our speakers. Please keep in mind that we will have a Q&A session at the end. So please do use the Q&A box, which you will find at the bottom of your screen, and write in your questions there during the course of the event, and I will return to them when the time comes for questions. So in May 2021, Israeli airstrikes on the open-air prison that is Gaza destroyed 2 of the city's bookshops. Pictures circulated at the time of narrow rooms lined with bookshelves cast in a warm light. Loved places now gone. Gazans wrote of their grief for the loss of spaces they had returned to time and again in search of solace and inspiration in the words of others. I know these places, not these exact places, but places like them. Bookshops have been a place of refuge since my teenage years. Any spell of worry or loneliness could be lifted if I ducked into a bookshop. A slow walk among the shelves and the library quiet that book-filled spaces automatically induce would bring a sense of hopeful calm. Rows of books and reams of pages, all holding the possibility for adventure, company, rescue, and escape. I felt reassured knowing I was part of a world where people believed in finding each other and themselves through words. First, we grieve the lives of those whose homes crumble on their heads. And then we grieve the loss of places, which in returning to again and again become extensions of ourselves. In the midst of a massacre and a trapped and terrified population, the Israeli military had found the time and target to destroy a people's culture, history, stories, and poetry, its words. Today's event explores the theme of poetry and literature in occupied Kashmir and Palestine, where the practice of holding on to one's words and writing becomes, by its very nature, because of its being daily threatened, an act of resistance. I have sometimes found myself feeling guilty that the time I give to writing and words is time taken away from political struggle. But I think today's event suggests otherwise. The radical status of poetry under conditions of occupation in places like Palestine and Kashmir reminds us that it is radical to love and make poetry in a capitalist world, to give time and energy to words in a system that values profit, often generated by war, above all else. For women especially, as Audre Lorde writes, poetry is not a luxury, but forms the quality of light within which we predicate our hopes and dreams towards survival and change, first made into language, then into idea, then into more tangible action. I often think of the American poet Anne Sexton, who struggled with the societal expectation that she be a homemaker at the expense of her true self. She once spoke of how on first reading W.D. Snodgrass's poem Heart's Needle, that she was moved to action, suddenly clear-sighted. Certain it was what she wanted, she went and fetched her youngest child from her mother-in-law's home, where she had been living after Sexton was deemed too mentally unwell to raise her. Snodgrass's poem had woken up in her a desire and given her the self-confidence in her capacity to care for her daughter. Speaking about this event later in her life, Sexton said, "What could be more powerful than a poem to move you to action? Action that is ready to be born within you is right there, and yet it is the poem that arrives and brings you forth, and out you go." So it has always felt right and beautiful to me that the poem Sexton chose to read at the protest rallies against the Vietnam War was a love poem addressed to her eldest daughter. While other poets read works that evoked images of the horrors of war, Sexton read an ode to her daughter, both invoking love as a form of resistance and reminding us of the joy that lies at the heart of the reason for our struggle for peace. So on this note, I'll now introduce our two speakers, whose words themselves are acts of resistance, of oppression and occupation in Kashmir and Palestine. And then I'll give the floor to each of them in turn. And please let me remind you to use the Q&A box should any question or comment occur to you as you listen to them speak. So first we will hear from Ather Zia, who is a political anthropologist, poet, and short fiction writer. She's an assistant professor of anthropology and gender studies at the University of Northern Colorado. Ather is the author of Resisting Disappearances, Military Occupation and Women's Activism in Kashmir, and co-editor of Resisting Occupation in Kashmir, and A Desolation Called Peace. She has published a poetry collection titled The Frame. Ather's ethnographic poetry on Kashmir has won an award from the Society for Humanistic Anthropology. She is the founder and editor of Kashmir Lit and is the co-founder of Critical Kashmir Studies Collective, an interdisciplinary network of scholars working on the Kashmir region. Ather is also the founder editor of the e-zine based on Kashmir titled Kashmir Lit. After Ather speaks, we'll hear from Dalia Taha, who is a Palestinian poet and playwright living in Ramallah. Her first play, Kifaya, made in China, was produced by the Flemish Royal Theatre and A.M. Cotton Foundation and premiered in Brussels. Her play, Alab Nareya, Fireworks, was developed under the Royal Court's International Playwriting Residency and was produced there in 2015. Dalia graduated from Brown University with an MFA in playwriting and has published 2 collections of poetry and a novel. She recently completed her third play, There Is No One Between You and Me. Thank you. I will now hand over to Ather to kick us off.
Thank you so much, Nadine, and thank you, Emma and Tawfiq, for inviting me, and Dalia for joining me here for this conversation. I'm really happy to be in this conversation, and Nadine, we've talked before. So, it's a very difficult moment to be talking about poetry when thinking about Kashmir in this present situation, because of all the times, it's very unprecedented the level of attack that writing is under in Kashmir in 2023, so to speak. It's always been the case that Kashmiris have not been able to write what their freedom of expression, let's say, has not been easy for them it's always come with a cost. Censorship has been part and parcel of their life. But now there are several laws that are ensuring that no one can write. It's not as if it wasn't present before, but it's been institutionalized to such an extent that not even media can report. Reporters are easily tagged as terrorists and thrown into jail, even for a small time observation of a military ambush or something that they honestly want to report about, and that the Indian government is not shown in the positive light that they want to be seen. So as of now, Nadine spoke about the web scene Kashmir Lit. I do want to start by saying that if you were to go to the Kashmir Lit website, you'd see that there is a page that is dedicated to all the disappearing writing. So there is this thing that has happened in the past 4 or 5 years, that the writings of journalists and archives of newspapers are disappearing. And that's something that really, really is troubling, because there is going to be a point in time when this era that passed, maybe the last decade, or I don't know how long it's going to last, that there's going to be no archive off the ground. And that is what we're dealing with in this moment. So for Kashmir Lit, I was getting these requests. They have subsided a little bit now, but in the past 3 years, there were repeated requests from people to take off their writing, even as small as a poem. And then I would request them, I would say, can you just let it be there? I'll just make it anonymous. Or can you just let me have an archive, a backup? And they'd be like, no, we can't have it there. So I would have to completely delete it. And the reason is because for even a government job or anything that you are doing in Kashmir, for a small business, you have to ask the government for a permission. And the permission requires that you get a background check first. So if you do not check that you haven't been a dissident at some point, you haven't, that if you check out that, you are quote unquote, you have never done anything against the sovereignty of India, then only you get that clearance. So that background clearance really requires that you have no record, you have not written anything against India, so to speak. But that has also in the last 3 years included poems that people are taking down from Kashmir Lit. They're asking me, so this might be a Kashmir Lit specific example, but I have spoken to a couple of colleagues and friends who have had the same thing happen on their portals. So I call it the enforced disappearance of Kashmiri writing. So that's the moment I'm speaking of. That's the moment, that's the context of my talk. When I asked the questions that I'm asking in this paper that I'd written on poetry and dissent and placemaking in Kashmir, and the need to write poetry and how much poetry Kashmiris are writing. If you kind of like throw a stone, it's going to hit a poet in Kashmir. But it's also a very, very risky business in this moment, because poetry for us, as you said, that Nadine, you talked about Audre Lorde saying it's not a luxury. It is some sort of a business that doesn't give us any monetary benefit, but it does give a lot of emotional and a cathartic benefit for the society. So I do want to formally read some things, but then I'm going to kind of also open up into talking a little bit about if we have time, and maybe if we don't, then we move on to the conversation that Dalia and I and Nadine will have. So in the Indian occupied Kashmir, writing as of now, journalistic, fiction, prose, poetry, even clerical memos, they are completely banned, so to speak. If it presents, as I said, they're fatal, they're censured, and they're surveilled. Every word of dissent is excoriated. Every cog in the occupying military machinery ensures silence of Kashmiri people. How does one write in a place where words are banned and bodies are killable? What happens to those writers in such a place? The evidence of their predicament is not hidden, nor a surprise. Yet one question does loom large. Why do people continue to write even when it is fatal? How does one behold these death-defying writers, not just their work, but also as human beings? Because after everything is said and done, I'm an anthropologist, so I like writing. I know what poetry does for us, but also like, who is the poet? How does one, in Kashmir, the act of reading poetry is seen as means of incorporating resistance in everyday of people, where overt resistance is unsafe and subject to surveillance by authorities. Thus, in a place where reading is resistance, how do we contextualize writing poetry, or to exist as a poetry, exist as a poet, even simply? These questions are not mere indulgences in academic theories, but they're urgent to understand the everyday life and meaning and modes of resistance in today's Kashmir, the Palestine that no one knows about. And I'm sorry to kind of like, use Palestine as that kind of a comparison, but this is done with all affective law and affective and affection. The Indian military repression is relentless and ever-growing. The scourge of settler colonialism is rampaging the cultural, religious, political, and economic identity of Kashmiris. And this talk that pivots around poetry, it pivots around poetry as a category of analysis, and the figure of a poet as a humanistic optic to look at how forms of resistance shape in public and private domains. The analysis consists poets writing in Kashmiri and other vernacular languages, as well as English and Urdu. In an occupied zone where a war stands at all corners of home and streets, poetry ceases to be mere words. Poetry becomes ehtijaj, meaning protest, dissent, both in Urdu and Kashmiri. Poetry as ehtijaj is a situated act, a deeply political gesture, written, embodied, commemorative, and sometimes unsaid. And I think in this moment, unsaid is what I would underline, because sometimes poetry is just not written. And that becomes an act in itself, and that is the moment we are in. It is a form of placemaking, of course, in face of erasure and occupation. In context of Palestine, the loss of homes, land, memory, Ather Zia repurposes the concept of placemaking, which encapsulates the creation of a site of a narrative history to counter the increasing depredations of the occupiers' hegemony over knowledge and knowledge production and deepening settler colonial policies. Kashmiris are facing the onslaught, the same onslaught of Indian settler colonialism that has erased their territorial sovereignty, and from 2019 even more so, in face of the imminent dispossession of loss of land. Poetry becomes a place of reclamation and recovery. As a situated act of dissent, of placemaking, poetry also emerges as a right to remembered presence. It becomes a way to history, to commemoration, however feeble the effort might seem in face of the hegemony of the occupying powers of the Indian nation. I do have a few examples to say here, and I might resist from using the name of the poet that I'm going to be speaking about, even though it is published, but it's in an academic journal. I don't know who reads that, but I would resist from using it here. Most often, we think of contemporary poetry in Kashmir. The figure of late Agha Shahid Ali, who was a Kashmiri American poet, he looms large. Readily accessible in English-speaking audiences, Ali has become the de facto bard of Kashmir's tragedy. However, the realm of poetry in Kashmir has always brimmed with local voices who practice the art of writing in Kashmiri and other regional languages. In the year 1989, the Kashmiri Tehreek, or the resistance movement for self-determination, when it mobilized into an armed resistance, at that time, that was a dire time, of course, poetry books, irrespective of the topic, were dominantly published in comparison to fiction and other genres. And this is one of the eminent Kashmiri researchers and writers and a scholar of Kashmiri language, Professor Shafi Shok, who writes a paper in 1990, and he actually mentions this. The poets in Kashmir not only dare to write, but also persist in the art of surviving amidst war, because they don't just have to write, but then they have to survive on the street, outside, in their homes. Amidst war, which makes poetry not only their only skill. So survival is the next best skill, I think. The ethos of poetic responsibility to provide witness and commemoration is part of the cultural demand placed on poets. Due to limited space and purposes in this talk right now, so I'll just kind of like mention a couple of examples of some poets who have in the recent past been a part of like news in some way or the other. I just want to give this example of a 55-year-old poet who writes in Kashmiri, and he himself has been incarcerated in his past life. He has been called a terrorist, and then his home, they found the militants, the combatants in his home, and they burned his home to ground. He wasn't there, but he had to flee, and then the militants were in there. And he says that his poetry could be, his poetry could fill 15 to 55 books. That's the range he gives us. And all of that is burned to ash. Nothing remains. And then some of the newspapers that covered his story, they they showed him writing with a piece of charcoal, like he's writing poetry on his burnt house and the pillars. And that to me was so symbolic of the act that he was kind of like trying to do over and over, even in this burnt house, talking about these young boys who had been killed, and then talking about his entire repertoire, 30 years of his life's work that has gone to cinders. So that's the loss of his poetic archive is a deep wound. However, I found again, I have the luxury as an academic to, and someone who's living away from Kashmir, to say that I found it interesting. I know it's not interesting to him, it's completely devastating, but it's also theoretically interesting to see him write on the burnt pillars of his house. He's writing these poetic verses, and he's telling us he is, in that moment, to me, it seemed like the act of poetry the placemaking was so evident. I felt like not just placemaking, but poetry as an act, as a situated act of dissent, even when your entire repertoire, your entire written verse is completely gone. And I don't know how he's going to recuperate it, and I don't know how he is withstanding that loss. So Madhosh's act of poetry is a way to history, reclamation, and recovery of, I said his name, but is also recorded in the newspapers as well. Recovery of a collective memory against memoricide, where there is systematic erasure of identity, history of one's people in order to write that of another people's over it, because that's the moment in Kashmir right now. What we are seeing is a rewriting of history. And that is happening at all levels. It's happening in the Indian literature. It's also happening within Kashmir, the way the vocabulary is being deployed and the words that are being allowed to be used. So that is going to be in circulation, and we don't know how far that is going to create sort of like the de-archivization or the memory side in Kashmir. So that's what has been constituted as Indian, and nationalized Indian patterns in the last 72 years have been steadily imposed on everything that is Kashmiri. In the Indian nationalistic narratives, the combatants who were killed, they were criminalized as terrorists. But that's not what the poet calls them. That's not what the people call them. So that's one example that I wanted to give of when in recent history, poetry really was kind of highlighted as an act for me. And the poet himself, the humanistic optic of the poet, not just his poetry, because his poetry is gone. In a way, there does remain a lot that he has already written, that's already out, and that he has spoken about, but there is a lot that he had written which was not published, and that's completely gone. But he stood as an act. And the other example I want to give is of this mother who is not a poet. She is not even a writer, so to speak. She has not even formally gone to a school, but her son was forcibly disappeared in 1990s. And then when I was doing my research on the enforced disappearances in Kashmir, I came across a lot of mothers, a lot of people who were writing, and a lot of fathers who had actually written stuff, but they hadn't published. And one of them actually got a short monograph published, not about his son, but about his struggle and also about the history of Kashmir. So there was this thing. And the other thing is that the people who were in that struggle and who are in that struggle, they did not come from the higher social standing, so to speak. They were mostly from the marginalized social classes. So not all of them were formally schooled. So they did not write, but they spoke, and they had a repertoire of songs at their disposal and poetry at their disposal. And that's another subject which they sang. But this particular mother, she used to sit in her courtyard and she used to versify all the time. And then when she talked about her life, she said that she was usually very sought after during weddings and during some special occasions where she could go and sing, because she also made impromptu verses. And now she was versifying her tragedy and she was singing it. And the first thing that I noticed was as an academic, as someone who documents, I was like, this should be documented. And I was trying to look for someone who would document her verses and capture them. And then she said something very profound. She's like, just want to read the translation, if I can find it. But what she actually said was that the greatest poem and the greatest writing that had come from Allah itself was her son. And when he's not recorded or captured or he's been disappeared and he's not safe somewhere, then what use is my writing or documenting my poetry? And that never happened after that. I could not capture her verses, no one else could. And technically it was gone, but because it has been recorded in different places, the iconic, her optic, her humanistic optic, her viewpoint, her vantage, and even in the book that I've written and here, I feel like that's some sort of archivization that happens of the poet and not just the poetry. So these are the two examples that I wanted to kind of like touch upon, because we talk about English writers a lot in Kashmir. We usually don't look at the vernacular writers who have continued to write poetry. And mostly these people, they live in places which are in danger zones, extreme danger zones. Kashmir is, as they call it, the most beautiful prison. But at the same time, there are more dangerous zones. And these poets who often write in Kashmiri, they might not live in the better part of the city where there is slightly less, problems, but they might live in places where these things are actually happening. And for them to write and then to speak about it, I feel that's the highest act of bravery that anyone can do. And they stop being just poets and they become something else in that moment. So the other thing I also wanted to say about Kashmir and poetry is that it's a long-standing tradition, but there is also the idea of poetic responsibility. Like, what does poetry mean for Kashmiri? So we have had this long-standing discussion in local Kashmiri poetry that, Kashmir's history has been 500 years of occupation, starting right from Mughals, like when non-Kashmiris. And there is more history to it, like who Kashmiris, indigenous Kashmiris and non-Kashmiris were. But in the recent history, Kashmiris kind of like track back right from the time of Mughals in 1586, somewhere in the 16th century, when their occupation began from outside occupiers. And then there is this conversation, like what kind of poetry has been produced during that time in these 500 years. And many people kind of point to the lacunae that we don't have poetry that kind of pushes against these occupiers. There's no overt poetry. Like, there is a lot of poetry. We have a lot of mystic poets that have written from 15th, 16th century onwards, and who have and they have written lots of books. They have they have compendiums that have been compiled. Not that they wrote books in their own time, and they have also been sung. But at the same time, there is this discussion that these people have not really spoken against these occupiers. And why didn't they speak against these people in those times when these occupiers were coming in? There were the Afghans, there were the Mughals, there were the Sikhs, there were the Dogras, there were the English. Why haven't people actively written against? If the poets, we had so many poets, and it's a rich literary heritage. So what happens in those times, and there are scholars like the professor I earlier mentioned, Shafi Shawk, he argues that what used to happen was that Kashmiris would kind of take a back seat in a way, and they would descend into these mystic moorings. Rather than going to the political underpinnings of the time, they would descend into their mystic life. They would descend into Islam and Quran and talk through all of those idioms rather than speaking to the occupier directly. And then suddenly you also see the preeminence of hereafter rather than the here in all of that poetry. And so that's something that I kind of wanted to bring into play, because I feel like this current moment is also somewhat of that moment, because now you can't really directly speak against the occupier. Even if you're writing, there was an article written by a graduate student, someone who was getting his PhD. He had written an article 10 years back, and he's incarcerated right now because of that article. And I'm sure like there are other things that they are alleging on him, but at the same time, this article was used as a ruse. And they said that this is against the sovereignty of India. So that is the moment that we're speaking in. That's the moment that we're talking about. And in this moment, how are poets writing? And the other thing that I want to talk about is not just poets writing, but also writers who are fiction writers or who are columnists and essayists. one of the biggest problems in this moment, and this is an academic community, and I do want to talk about this, is that as we are trying to gather together edited volumes of special issues, even on creative writing, people are dropping out. They're not, and there's so much repression that people are like, we want to contribute, but we cannot, because this is going to be penalized after everything is said and done. We don't know how it's going to be taken. So people are staying silent. So how do we see poetry in that moment, and not just poetry, but other forms of writing? And how do we comprehend this particular moment, which I really see as the enforced disappearance of Kashmiri writing? And that's how I have kind of memorialized this on Kashmir Lit website. And I have used some empty pages to represent the deleted pieces, and the pieces that I'm continuously on almost like now monthly basis trying to take off from the site because people don't want them there. So in that moment, I feel like there is a distinct process that is happening and that needs to be captured as such. And I know that poetry is important, and I write poetry myself, and that's my positionality as well in this huge sort of fight that Kashmiris are fighting, one that is very overt and one that's very covert. And how do we capture both of them? And how does poetry as placemaking, as a place of dissent, as a situated act, how does that come across in this moment? And my biggest worry is that people outside Kashmir might be able to write, people who have already put themselves out there, they might be able to write, but what happens to the unsaid word that is not able to come out? And that's where I'll stop. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Ather. That was fascinating. And I certainly have a lot of thoughts and points for discussion for you, but I will hand over first to Dalia to speak now. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Ather, for this insightful presentation. I'll be reading something that I wrote about writing in a place like Palestine. Okay. Every time I read a letter written by a Palestinian political prisoner, I am filled with this strange sense that it is part of an infinite conversation. A conversation that was launched way before the letter was written. A conversation that started from the first human inscriptions on stones, their paintings on walls, and carried on in their philosophical debates, their wandering poems, their place seeking to understand the human in a world governed by larger forces. A conversation that commenced with the desire of humans to understand the world, their place in it, and their flattering yet also beautiful attempts to make something of their bewilderment and pain, turning these feelings into larger utterances about life. A conversation that was carried on by those who insisted on telling the truth, correct our illusions, and reveal the unseen forces working underneath our reality. Perhaps what I recognize in their letters is that which distinguishes great work in the humanities: the search for what deserves to be investigated, the desire to make the world a more humane place to live in. Sometimes letters written by prisoners find their way into our hands. This is no ordinary occurrence, because before they appear on our screens, there are those who received them, copied them, edited them, and made sure that meanings were conveyed correctly. They arrive after a dangerous journey. But what are we expected to do with them when they fall in our hands, coming from a place that was built to silence the writers of these letters? Perhaps the question that we ought to ask ourselves is this: how can we be serious and stern readers of these letters? Perhaps the answer to this question lies in the literal reading of these letters. Most of them are written in small fonts, on paper that is scarce, requiring a great effort if we are to decipher the words. Understanding the real letter inside these letters, the humanist and ethical lesson that it offers, requires us to start from the lesson that the literal reading of the letter provides, which is to recognize and feel that deciphering them is not an easy task. It's true that these letters issue from profound suffering, from the harshest places on earth, but it's unfair to reduce them to this. In reality, these letters contain fundamental truths, a truth that now seems essential and important in a world that is built to stub out our belief in responsibility, commitment, and possibility. To listen attentively with a great fidelity, this is the only way to make sure these letters arrive and find their purpose, which is to release us back into the world, better readers of it. Like all the voices that defended the truth in a world that prefers to shy away from it, those who carry these letters like lanterns know that their larger battle is not against their jailer or killer, but against the forces that help keep a society dormant. They know that these forces work tirelessly to fabricate a fantastical story about our world, satisfying a horrid appetite to refashion pain as normalcy. These forces destroy the richness of our experience, insisting on making very small compartments for our ideas of the human identity, society, desire. One of the most eviscerating truths about these forces is the fact that through them runs no path to changing or altering our world, or perhaps to the possibility of overcoming old preconceptions. They lay waste our belief in the power of the people, shame the impulse to be angered by pain, criminalize the struggle for justice. We can see examples of this all over the world, not only in Palestine. The carriers of lanterns know that these forces and the stories they tell are more insidious and pernicious, more deeply rooted than those who would kill us. They lurk unnoticed in our daily lives, in the form of innocent desires and ambitions, obsessions about personal success, nonchalance towards the pains of others, spiteful competitiveness, and greed. We can feel their deeply ingrained power in certain moments, in the way that we flee across the street when we see a stranger approach, in our blind hatred towards those who are made to see as others, in our fear of those who tell us a different truth, in the belief that safety comes from installing surveillance cameras rather than working against poverty and inequality, in disbelieving the power or need for protests, strikes, and political actions of all kinds. I'm starting my panel on writing with the writing of prisoners because prison is the most difficult place to write, and because the life of these letters can tell us a truth about the work that writing should do, which is to arrive from a place where a writer is aware of the bars behind which he lives and wants to make others see the bars behind which they live. Writing seeks to break bars, to free us. In that simple exercise, it can remind us that jails and fortresses are not as impregnable as they seem, that we can always find a way to communicate. I turn to prisoners' letters when I question the role of writing and ask what it should do in a world in which we are killed and brutalized every day. How to continue writing and speaking when you are being silenced. How to insist on telling the truth in a world where the powerful have the capacity to silence you. How to feel what truths are necessary. I'm talking about prisoners because in Palestine, imprisonment is one of the many of the main ways by which Israel silences and brutalizes us, especially the practice of administrative detention. Administrative detention is a procedure that allows the Israeli military to hold the prisoners indefinitely on the basis of secret information without charging them or allowing them to stand trial. About 40% of Palestinian men in the occupied territories have been arrested since 1967. Women are also incarcerated, as are children and teenagers. Many of my friends and colleagues, relatives, students, teachers have once been prisoners. A tool of subordination and humiliation, the prison is at the center of our lives. The violence of administrative detention transforms the life of the prisoner into an unbearable experience. In a voice message smuggled out of prison during the most recent hunger strike, which was undertaken by 59 Palestinians, prisoner and hunger striker Ghassan Zawahiri describes their release from a prison as a release into another prison, where you are waiting for your next imprisonment. You are unable to commit fully to anything, knowing that you will be arrested again. You are woken in the middle of night by any sound outside, thinking they are coming for you. As for your family, they have to endure the pain and horror of arrests, the sudden transformation of your house into a military barracks. You are unable to know your children or your sisters. Inside the prison, Palestinians endure brutal torture. I have spent days reading the details of this torture on the website of the only organization who works to legally support prisoners. The organization itself is harassed and assaulted by Israeli forces. It has now been condemned as a terrorist organization, and its offices been raided over and over again, with laptops and documents confiscated. Despite these horrors, our prisoners remain unflinching. Throughout the years, they've led strikes and staged acts of resistance to improve the conditions of their lives, or to protest the injustices of their incarceration. They have also produced books, poetry, children's literature, letters, academic research, and all kinds of literary and academic work that enriches our imagination and expands the practice of our resistance. They are our heroes, our teachers. Held behind bars, denied all pleasures, including simplest things like a view of the sky or the sight of a rose, brutalized and tortured, Palestinian political prisoners keep fighting, using ingenious ways to write and to explore why writing matters. They know that humans suffer other kinds of imprisonments, and they know that writing has to make people aware of the cells they might be living in. In doing so, it can show us the possibility of many kinds of freedoms. In a world where we can only imagine personal salvation, they insist on collective salvation. They remind us that being a better dreamer means being a better human, that we can't imagine a better world unless everyone has a share in it, that we have no choice but to fight against injustice. Walid Daqqa writes, I worry all the time that I might stop feeling shocked and moved by the pain of other people, any people. I worry that I will no longer be moved by scenes of injustice, any injustice. The act of being moved is for me a daily endeavor by which I gauge my strength and resilience. Aisha Aude writes, I never dreamt of gold or fancy clothes. The sight of gold on the bosoms of women felt vulgar. We dreamt of a free country in which we can travel not as strangers. We wanted to create a beautiful and a free world. Salah Hamouri writes, for me, real life is in the train to freedom and its sacrifices, and not in the station waiting for someone to manufacture our freedom. Palestinian political prisoners write to us. Their letters, which issue out of the darkest of places, are philosophical disquisitions on what it takes to live with others in this world, committed to understanding it, believing that we can change it. In this smuggled voice message addressing Palestinians and detailing the life of Palestinian political prisoners and the reasons for why they were committed to a hunger strike, Zawahiri ends the letter. He signs it, "Your sons and daughters." And something falls into place for me, because the destiny of the son is to look with piercing, questioning eyes onto what has for others become normalcy. The destiny of the son is to face his father and to tell him about all the things the father cannot see anymore. To be a son is to carry the responsibility of having to reiterate again and again the injustices of the world he has inherited. This is what writing should do. It can't stop reiterating. It can't get tired. I would like to end this presentation by reading from Walid Daqqa's letter, Parallel Time. I wasn't planning to write today about time or a place or about parallel time or anything else really, like philosophy or politics. All I wanted to write about were the sources of my anguish, about what I like and what I hate. But the writing that I had not planned to do resembles the life I had not planned to live. Let me admit, in fact, that I have never planned anything. I didn't plan to become a fighter, nor a member of a political party, nor to be involved in politics. This is not because all this has happened to me, happened by mistake, or because politics is a hateful thing, as some people like to think, but because to me these were big and complicated topics. I'm not a fighter or a politician by choice. If I had had my way, I would simply have lived my life as a laborer, painting walls, or an attendant at a gas station, which is what I was doing when I was arrested. I could have married one of my relatives, just like everyone else. She could have given birth to 7 or 10 children. I could have bought a truck or learned the intricacies of selling cars or exchanging currency. All of this was possible until I was confronted with the atrocities committed during the wars in Lebanon, like the massacres of Sabra and Shatila, which shook me to the core. I worry all the time that I might stop feeling shocked and moved by the pain of other people, any people. I worry that I will no longer be moved by scenes of injustice, any injustice. The act of being moved is for me a daily endeavor by which I gauge my strength and resilience. The capacity to feel the pain of other people, the pain of other humanities, is at the heart of civilization. The expression of the mental aspect of a man is his will. The essence of his physicality is work. And the essence of his spirituality is feeling. And to feel the pain of fellow human beings, the pain of other humanities, is the essence of a human civilization. This essence is what is targeted during every day and hour and year of a prisoner's life. You are not targeted as a political being, nor as a religious being and a consuming being who is being denied the pleasures of a material life. What is targeted inside you is your social side, the human inside you. They do everything to make us hate them. What is targeted is your love and your humanity. I will admit now, in my 20th year in a prison, that I don't feel hated, nor do I feel beset by the indifference of prison life. I will admit that I become childishly happy for the simplest things. A word of praise or encouragement overjoys me. I will admit that my heart quickens at the sight of a rose on TV or a natural vista like the sea. I will admit that despite everything, I am happy. There are no joys of life that I miss, except for 2 scenes of children and laborers. the sight of children drifting in from all parts of the village in the morning heading to school, and the sight of laborers in the early hours of morning trickling in from all streets and corners during a cold, foggy winter morning, trotting towards the town center, all set to make the trip to work. I will admit now that it would not have been possible for me to feel these feelings, that it would not have been possible for all this love to remain with me if I had not had the love of my mother Farida and of my wife Sana and of my brother Husni, if I had not had the support of my parents and felt encircled by loved ones and friends. I will admit now that I'm still a human, clutching my love as if it were an ember, that with this love in hand, I will remain resilient, and that I will love you, for love is my humble victory over my jailer. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dalia, for that really moving piece that you've written, but also reading us those words just now, which I know was difficult for you to read, but I think speak so powerfully, I think, to the themes of today's event. I think that what I found really touching was this idea that what keeps the prisoner alive, what keeps the prisoner going is an already known feeling of love. So a familiar feeling of having been loved, and from having known joy and having known beauty, and then the kind of holding of that inside oneself to both keep oneself going as a human under such torturous circumstances, but also to keep a person writing, to keep a person producing and communicating, and trying to reach the hearts, the minds, the selves of other people. Because I think it was a really powerful point that you made earlier on as you were speaking about how prisoners' letters are written not to reach the oppressor, but actually to reach the society, to reach the people, to make them, to kind of shake them alive, to resist. Because while they are in prison, the people outside are free, are still free, and yet living under the normalization of oppression and violence, which can keep them prisoners inside themselves, and can keep them from resisting, and can keep them from living, and can keep them from being brave. And I thought, for example, of an Egyptian political prisoner at the moment, Ala Abdel Fattah, and how his book, or his collection of writings, its title and its address, just as you were saying, Dalia, is "You have not yet been defeated." And it is not addressed to the oppressor. It is not addressed to the Egyptian state. It is addressed to the Egyptian people, telling them that you are still free, you still have the time, and you can still resist. And I think, again, by seeking to reach the humanity of people and demonstrating one's own, the prisoner keeps himself or herself alive. And I was really moved by that. So thank you so much. I want to ask you both a couple of questions, which I think, or a question which I think moves off nicely from where you've finished, Dalia, and from something you were saying earlier, Ather. But before I do, I was going to say, I think at the moment we don't have questions in the Q&A box, which is fine. If people are happy to just sit and listen, I'm sure that Ather and Dalia and I will have a very rich discussion ourselves. But if you do have questions or even just thoughts or comments for our speakers, please do put them in the Q&A, and I'll come back to them. Ather, when you were speaking, I was interested in the point you were making about how the question that scholars and others ask of poets, of why at certain points poets haven't or don't or aren't presently writing against the conquerors or writing against the oppressors through the ages. And I suppose in that there is this question of, well, we might there might be the question, which I think connects to Dalia's point about addressing the conqueror, addressing the oppressor. But actually, I think probably that isn't necessarily implied by the question. It could also be, you know, another form of poetry. And of course, the letter that the words that Dalia read us were themselves poetic, lyric words, not addressed to the oppressor, but nevertheless against the oppressor. So I imagine that the question kind of includes writing of that kind. But I guess the two questions I have to ask you both is, can one choose to write politically through one's art? Is that a choice that can be made? If we think, for instance, about poetry or art or artistic expressions as having or as being expressions of the unconscious, and I think so much of what Dalia was saying relates to the freedom of the self being necessary in order to then work towards the freedom of others and one's own. And I think that is really clear in the words that you ended on, Dalia, where you talked about where Walid Daka talked about the love that he knew almost has allowed him to flourish and survive under these conditions of oppression. Were we not to have or to know love, or were we not to have that that knowledge of that love, you know, would our psyches be free enough for artistic expression, for example? So that's one question. And then I suppose the follow-on from that is, if art is such an expression of the unconscious, then can we deploy art for political ends and for political means? Can we choose to, you know, to direct our voices towards a particular political end? And so I was going to ask you both, and I'm sure our audience will be curious about your own creative practices in this regard, because you both write so beautifully and lyrically, poetically in your work, which certainly has this political content and this political intention and this political end. So you know, is that a question that occurs to you, or is it just a voice that comes, or is it a voice that you then direct against the oppressor, your artistic voices? And I think that connects also to what you were saying, Dalia. So if you wouldn't both mind, you know, addressing that question, and also if you have questions for each other, which I'm sure you do, please do ask them of each other in your contributions now. Ather, shall we come to you, and then I'll come to you, Dalia? Is that okay? Great, thanks.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Nadine. Thank you, Dalia. That was really moving. So Nadine, the questions you ask, like so much in there. I don't know which particular thread to connect to. So one of the things that really jumped at me as you were speaking was thinking about artistic expression and sort of like its deployment. I also began thinking about how much demands we make of artistic voices, especially in a moment of repression, in a moment when people are not able to express what they need to get expressed. You know, long back, I used to work with this poet who wrote in Urdu and was very well-known critic of Urdu and poet as well. We used to edit a magazine together in Kashmir. It was called the Daily Jahat meaning dimensions. And it used to publish Urdu poetry, Kashmiri poetry, some Kashmiri poetry, mostly translations, and also a lot of critical pieces and pieces on literature, stories, and it ran for quite a while in the late 90s, early 2000s. And, you know, we would get overtly political pieces and he would turn them down because he did not want it to run into problems. I mean, he wouldn't turn them down out of like he didn't want to publish them, but he knew that the writers would get into a problem. And we were trying to, at that time, put this magazine in government offices and ask the government offices to buy them and stuff like that. And they could not buy something that had stuff like that. So then, but there would be a lot of poetry, which was quote unquote resistance poetry. So I asked him this question one day. I said, how is it that you're not publishing those pieces, but you let the poet? He's like, this is poetry. You can say anything. And I mean, I know that it's a very shallow or a trivial example of what poetry can do, and you can say anything. And so that was that time. It was the 90s, early 2000s, that people were still writing poetry, and they were being as political as possible in their artistic expression. And they were saying things that they needed to say, and it was still poetry. And now we are in a moment where there is poetry already published like 7-8 years on a website, and people want to unpublish this poetry. And I'm not saying all are doing that. I'm saying some are doing that. So that's the context. That's the journey. That's the chronology. And this is also to say that it's not as if people are not writing poetry, as if they're not writing other forms of creative art. They are doing that. But then there is also this thing as well, which is present. And the other thing that came to my mind was passing of this poet, very well-known, renowned Kashmiri poet, Rahman Rahi. He recently passed. And one of the discussions around his entire repertoire of writing was that he hasn't really spoken to the tragedy of Kashmir. Like, one of the biggest grudges that people have, not just scholars or writers or poets, have against him is that he hasn't really spoken to the Kashmiri tragedy and the politics of Kashmir. But when you read his entire you will see that he has spoken of Kashmir's tragedy, politics, and he has actually mourned and he has talked about it. But it's almost like there is this unforgiving, unflagging criticism and critique against him that you haven't spoken to. And there are several other political reasons for that. But that to me really becomes it becomes a very important point. Like, what is it that we demand of poets? What is it that we demand of these voices in this moment? Like, what did he have to do? Did he have to plant a flag and then also plant his books around it and say that this is how I've spoken to it? Did he have to sing it? What did he have to do? And what is it that people are actually asking him? And there are scholars who are saying the same thing. And then I read his work and I'm like, I think he has spoken nothing in the last 40 years except speak to the pathos and tragedy and the political issues in Kashmir in different ways, in poetic forms. What the other poet long back said, that you can write anything in poetry and it can be construed as anything, so these people will not get in trouble. But here you have a poet who is speaking something that is speaking to what people want him to speak about, which is Kashmir, politics and tragedy and pathos and memory and loss. And he's doing all of that. And we are still not satisfied. We're like, no, he didn't really speak to it. He hasn't spoken about it. He's been very quiet for the last 40 years, but he hasn't been. So that to me is like, there is also this, there are people writing, but there is also this moment of frustration, especially Kashmir becomes a very special case. So that's one of the things that I really, when we see Kashmir and Palestine side by side, and then we kind of think of this comparison and we think so many similarities and overlaps, which I also see in my work as affective relationship that we share with each other, the affective nature of love that is between Kashmiris and Palestinians, even though we don't have any physical connections between the struggles, but they are emotionally same, the affective solidarity that we have for each other, especially from the Kashmiri side, I can say for that. But one of the things that we also need to understand is the political situation in Kashmir. It is, I know that quote unquote Israeli settler state is the largest democracy in the Middle East, so to speak, but then India is also touted as that. No one really looks at it as the neoliberal state that it is, and the kind of the colonization that it has done in Kashmir in the last 72 years. So it gets away with a lot of things, especially saying it's a democracy, and then trapping people in this politics of democracy. And once they are inside it, they don't have anywhere else. Like the international community, as of now, in these 74 years, Kashmiri situation has gone so bad that, of course, it's also re-internationalized in a way. But on the other hand, India has gotten away with so much. It's been narrativized in a way that we cannot go to international forums without going through Indian institutions first, because it is seen as part and parcel of being in a country. So they have to redress everything that is happening wrong inside Kashmir. And it's a very ironic situation because India is doing everything wrong, and you cannot go to its courts and its judiciaries. So what's happening inside Kashmir is there's this double layer of invisibilization that has happened. So the censor has a meaning. The media gag has a meaning for people, because how do you survive? How do you write in a situation? And you're talking about prisoners' letters. There used to be a time in the 90s, 2000, and even now where people are writing, prisoners are writing, they're trying to get an education. But at the same time, I see this new insidious way of cracking down on writing, on all forms of writing, even poetry, which can be construed in this post structures or whichever wave we are writing on, can be construed as anything. But how do you? So that's where I kind of like think of myself. I feel like I don't write vague poetry. Like, vague poetry, to use the word, where you can kind of construe anything. If something seems vague, I bring the word Kashmir back in because I want it to be read as Kashmir. Sometimes I feel like, okay, I have the luxury because I am situated in Western academia, I can write it the way I want it. And whatever repercussions it will have, it has to have those. I mean, we choose those positionalities, we choose those locations, and it's very sad in some ways, but I think it's also a strength. So that's how I choose to deploy it. There was a question that I got very recently about the work that I had published. Someone said, hey, you haven't really published overtly feminist poems about the gendered condition of women and you as a woman and all these travails that we face. And I that's a conscious choice. I have that kind of poetry, but the poetry that I choose to put out and that I choose to publish is based around Kashmir, and it kind of like takes the issue head on. And that's where I feel like, okay, if someone thinks this is not art, this is mostly like, putting stuff together and just writing about Kashmir in a poetic form, so be it. May the art be not that great, but the message and the content be what I need it to be. So that is, I don't know if I'm answering the question you asked, Nadine, but that is, it's a conscious choice to deploy the art or artistic sensibility like that. And I feel it's much needed, especially when I know and see, I see how many poems are not written. And I don't mean to say not written as in they don't write them. When they're not published, when a poet doesn't get its audience. Someone posted on Facebook recently a Kashmiri poet. He said, "What is Black Death?" And again, then he was very vague about it. He's like, when a poet is not able to write about social issues, and I know what he meant. He meant what he's seeing, he's not able to write about. So that's Black Death for him. And we do these poetic events on Kashmir Lit, where we bring Kashmiri poets and they talk about their poetry. And mostly what people are able to talk about is not the poetry they probably want to reach the audience. It's something else. And that is the moment we are living in Kashmir right now. And people back home are living right now, and me seeing them here, I'm living and reliving it in my writing. So I think that to me is becoming more important, not just the act of poetry making, which I think happens, but it's also what happens to the act, who gets to witness it. And if no one is witnessing it, and this is a big issue, right? Yesterday in Washington Post, there was an article about this young activist, Rakib Naik, who has this website, hindutvawatch.org, and he's kind of like watching what the Hindus are doing and hate crimes and all of that. But in that article, there is a moment where he talks about something that is really stuff of nightmares, which is what happens to this moment, which is not being archived, not in poetry, and people are actively wanting their writing to go away. And then you also have a concerted effort by the Indian occupation to de-archivize Kashmir. And we have reputed newspapers who don't have their archive before 2016. Nothing is left on the internet. So that's kind of like how I'm thinking about what I was able to address in your question. And I hope I did some justice.
No, you absolutely did. Thanks so much, Ather. I think the question that everything you said was so interesting and relevant to what I was thinking, but I think I was really interested in what you said about the kinds of demands we make of poets. You know, somebody can produce such a volume of work and actually be resisting in the way that you and Dalia have been talking about, simply by writing, you know, really no matter the subject, but writing under the condition of oppression, writing poetry is itself resistance, even if you are writing about, you know, watching the children go to school rather than something more concretely about violence that one might have witnessed carried out by the oppressor. And so I'm curious, or I'm interested in the question of how the condition of oppression almost produces this other layer of oppression from the oppressed, to say to the artist, you must perform in this particular way, or your artistic voice, your artistic expression. And I think that even in the West, I think the expectation again is that we will somehow, and I think you were speaking to this a bit, Ather, use our identities, right from our identities, or how we are perceived, or from our minority or marginalized positions, rather than whatever else artistic expression might come from us, that we should somehow address our condition of oppression or our condition of minoritization or marginalization, which I experience as a form of oppression. You know, the demand, for example, you were saying, is someone saying to you, why are you not writing from the perspective of you know, a woman, and a woman living under gender oppression, etc. So I think that demand, you know, that is made of artists and writers, both in the minoritized position, like in a white hegemonic space, but also in a condition of oppression, the artist must write about, you know, the most pressing, most tragic, rather than simply express oneself, which itself is, as you were saying, you know, is itself a radical move, is I think a really interesting question. Those kinds of layers of oppression. Dalia, I wanted to come to you if you had any thoughts about what Ather was saying, or the question that I asked at the start. Yeah, whether you want to come back on anything.
Yeah, I can maybe also talk a little bit about how we live in a world where we also tend to think of poetry and politics as, you know, at opposite ends of each other. And like, if a poet is politicized, then there is something wrong with his poetry. And I've been really thinking about this for a long time, because I'm also interested in like, what does poetry do in this world? How it can also be political, but not in our narrow definitions of political. Yani, I think there is a difference between being political and ideological, in the sense that you can actually, being political is about actually pushing against certain boundaries, or like ideas, but I think, yani, right now I believe actually that poetic and political is the same thing in the end. So if we think about what is poetic, yani, what does poetry do? What does a poetic sentence do? And why does it move us? It moves us because, you know, it creates this sudden proximity between two things that seem irrelatable to each other. And I think literally this is what politics tend to do in the radical sense of politics. Yani, like, you know, like and poetry creates, yani, when it does this, it creates a new sense of coherence. And the moment it does that, it can't be overlooked or like pretend that it doesn't exist. Once you know, a poem states something, halas, you believe you see it, you see this new coherence that didn't exist before. And I think any new political moment came with this, came with a new sense of coherence, and to try to create a new sense of relating to others you didn't see yourself in relation with, or sharing the same conditions or the same I think they are the same in that way, because they both push us to يعني anyway. But in addition to that, I think يعني for me poetry can be about anything, but it is political because it's trying to and the other thing I wanted to say about the relationship between the political and the poetic is also we tend to think of like politics as something that exists in a separate world as governments, but also like literally any political regime or it doesn't only exist outside us. It like governs the way we think, we imagine, we sympathize, we feel, who we hate, who we don't. For like poetry suggests a new way of feeling. In that sense, it is political or opens up new horizons or ways of thinking.
Absolutely. I love that idea. And I think exactly that sense that you capture that, what is it to be moved? It's both emotionally or psychically, but it's also moved physically into action. And I think that's something I was trying to capture at the beginning, that actually poetry can move us to action. And I think that you're right, that they're closer, that the politics and poetry are closer than we think, that this divide that, if something is a political poem, it's not really poetry, it's masquerading as a poem, but it's not really, it's doing something else. It's actually, if you think of the physiological and psychic response, in our bodies and our minds that is produced by poetry, I think actually, you speak about that beautifully. I think that's right. It captures really well how, the political and the poetic are much closer than we would tend to think.
And just commenting on that, when you read a beautiful poem, your instinctive reaction is to put the book and move, literally. Absolutely. And when I think about it, it's literally what poetry does to us, and that's why it's political. It changes us to change our position, like to move away from where we've been standing or looking at things. It changes our language, our awareness, and in that it is, it's political in a radical sense.
Absolutely.
So just to add to what you both are saying, so I have something that I've been thinking for a long time, like how good a poet am I? Am I a poet at all? Should I claim the title? Title as in call myself one. And then it's also like in the recent years, I've been thinking a lot about like decolonial element of our work, like how we're decolonizing our work in some ways, even though we're still writing in English and we're still speaking in English, so there's so much Eurocentric perspective that is still imposing on us, and we live in the Western Hemisphere. So given all that, and also the decolonizing move, I feel like one of the things that we can do and we need to do is to, like, who puts all these standards on us, that if this is a poem that is overtly political, that takes things away. And that happens in academia a lot. The moment you begin speaking of examples and your theory goes kind of like away and it becomes grounded theory, since you're less of a theorist. So I think I've personally moved beyond that. And when I started in academia, I was already a little bit beyond that. I was intimidated for sure, but I already was beyond that because my work was overtly political, and it always will be overtly political. It will be more political than political. And I think everything is political, personal is political. And when your personal is politics itself, then it's doubly political. So that's who we are. And I feel like I don't want to be judged on the standards of Shakespearean poetry or whoever else is there. I just want to write the way I want to write. And I don't care if it's not considered to be. And I use the word, I tell my kids, don't say I don't care, because they say I don't mind. But I am using the word, I don't really care who thinks of it as poetry or good poetry, bad poetry, as long as I'm writing, because I know that's a luxury for us in this moment and has always been. And if you have an expression, and sometimes I also think about, like, why did I have to travel to West to write? And now I probably have an answer, like, why do you have to travel so far to write about your homeland? And also, like, when you're in someone else's genocidal nightmare. But in this moment, I think all of these questions, they're kind of like them sort of like swirling in my brain, and I'm thinking constantly about them. But I do know that we are doubly, if not trebly, political. And that's what our voices are going to look like. And if it's not considered art by some people, I don't really want them to read me.
Thank you, Ather, so much for adding that. So we've got two questions from the audience that I'd like to go to now before we run out of time, since we're due to finish at 3:30. So first, we've got a question from Shira. Shira says, thank you, Ather and Dalia, for such a beautiful and powerful discussion. Your reflections on the place and responsibility of archives, poetry, and letters was really moving. After this point around the absence of political poetry and descent into the sacred makes me wonder about the role of non-secular rituals of writing or resistance, and what other imaginaries of the political are possible outside of the secular, thinking here about Sabah Mahmood's work. And if these practices not easily read as political, or not easily read, as political, are openings to other forms of refusal. And Dalia, if you know of any bodies of literature on Palestine that engage with mystical thought that might be interpreted as political, all works that tend to that intersection. So that question, if the speakers wish to read it, appears in the chat, so you should be able to see that. We have one other question, which, if it's okay, I will read out now and then give you both a chance to respond as you wish. Is that okay if I read out the other question we have? Okay, so this question is from Suhail. Professor Zia, you mentioned affective solidarity between Kashmiris and Palestinians, and you've discussed it in one of your works. As you also pointed out, that this solidarity is manifested more by Kashmiris. How do we ensure that this solidarity is expressed equally on both sides, given A, there is a lack of awareness about the Kashmir conflict among the larger international community, and B, there is the challenge of highlighting the Kashmir issue in the Arab world, a space already dotted with several conflicts. So Dalia, if I could go to you first, if that's okay, if you want to answer. You can obviously come back to both questions, because I think actually it'd be nice to hear both your thoughts, both of you on both questions, and we'll probably wrap up after that, I imagine, because if you each speak for a few minutes on those. And obviously if people have more questions, do ask them, but I'll hand over to you, Dalia, and then Ather.
I'm still thinking. Regarding I don't have a definite answer for how to work or improve solidarity between Kashmir and Palestine, but something like this is a good example of I think when I read about the Kashmir, the situation in Kashmir, I was so moved, and I was like, wow, this is literally our life, but in a different place, different language, different occupying power. But I was telling my friends, it's literally, you can write the same story, but you can change the names. Use Palestinian names or Kashmiri names, and it's exactly the same story. And I've been thinking about this: what to do with what can one do about this? To be honest, I still don't know a definite answer, but I think in the beginning, a good starting point for me always is that when I learned about the situation in Kashmir, it wasn't what I learned, what I was taught wasn't only what was happening there, the kind of conditions they live under, the atrocities they've experienced, but I also learned something else. From reading, I learned And I remember once I read an essay written by a journalist who was during the lockdown in Kashmir. He went to the streets and he interviewed people, asking them what do they think about just gathering, collecting their statements. And someone said something like this, everyone says that we are going to bring industrialization to Kashmir, we are going to open up, we are going to build factories, we are going to bring economic development, but who told you that any Kashmiri, this is what we fight for? Have you ever heard the Kashmiri standing, protesting and shouting, we want factories, we want economic growth, what we want is a freedom. And then he goes on saying, we know what Indian cities, what economic development and factories and industry brought to Indian cities. They brought pollution, they brought poverty, all these things. So we prefer to actually live in small homes. We just need our basic needs to be fulfilled. And for me, this is the kind of language and imagination that is not here in this world, where we are encouraged to dream in certain ways or improve our lives in certain ways or expect or have certain understanding of what improvement of life is. And what I learn when I read about what happens in Kashmir, I also learn other ways of beings that could be more enriching to us as humans. Any kind of solidarity means to me also what can people learn from each other, about what it takes to be alive, what it takes to live with others, how do we dream, how do we imagine.
Just to add,
Dalia, that's wonderful. Ather, I was literally just going to hand to you to come back on that. And Dalia, if you have a look at the question in the chat from Shaira, if you have any thoughts, either type them in the chat or I'll come back to you in a moment. But Ather, do you want to come back on Suhail's question? And if you have any thoughts about what Dalia was saying, that would be great.
So I want to start with what Dalia was saying, and then that also feeds into Suhail's question, and then maybe move on to Shaira's question. So Dalia was saying, like, what she was talking about, like her introduction to a Kashmiri situation and how there are so many resonances between the two, and then there are lots of differences between the two and what we can learn from each other. And I did try to make sense of it for myself long back. We did this special issue. It was the Goldie Asuri is the editor, and I'm also one of the co-editors. We edited this for identities about Kashmir and Palestine, and had scholars from both sides speak to each other or sometime. And then we also realized that they can't really speak to each other in that manner, but they will speak about their own places. And because this is just a beginning of conversation, which is also very much reflected in the conversation we are having. So these are Palestine and Kashmir are the two oldest issues on the agenda of United Nations. And I'm bringing in United Nations with all the decolonization kind of, and also the critique against it. But just to flag that they are kind of like these sister issues that emerged in 1948, and they were tabled, one of the first two issues regarding people's right to self-determination in 1948. So in that sense, they're kind of like connected. And Kashmiris have been following this for a long time. I mean, I know we are short of time, but when I started my doctorate, I had a senior cohort who was a Palestinian. And when I heard that he was a Palestinian, I thought, when I meet him for this meet and greet, I was kind of like, I was ready to meet him, and I kind of knew him because he was a Palestinian, because that's how Kashmiris think of Palestinians, their brethren. So it's but he didn't know much about Kashmir. I knew all about Palestine, and I'd read some of the literature, and I was already working in one of my research projects on Palestine. And that to me was a little bit of a surprise, but things have changed a lot since. So it's not as if things are remaining the same. And I do want to say, from in the last 10 years, Kashmir has been re-internationalized. I'm not saying internationalized in the manner because it's already an international issue, and India takes that away from Kashmir, saying that it's not an international issue, it's a domestic, it's a territorial issue between the two nation states, but it's an international issue that has been there. But since last 1 decade, it's been re-internationalized from 2019 more so. So there is more conversation. So speaking to Suhail's question, I feel like there is a lot of awareness that needs to happen. And I think these conversations, events like these, not just academics, activists, but also people to people, Facebook, social media, it has done a lot. I remember there was this one incident in 2016, stone throwing is a huge, in Palestine. It's also one of the iconic ways of protest in Kashmir, so that they kind of share that in that manner. There used to be a lot of tear gas that the Indian government would throw at the protests. And there was this one report about how Palestinian activists are sharing resources with Kashmiri activists and how to deal with it. So that was just like a brief moment in people trying to talk to each other, not just activists and not just academics and writers, and having that kind of an exchange, but other forms of exchange that really matters on the street, that keeps these resistances alive. So that's something that kind of exchange has happened. There was also a blog where young Palestinian writers, they were translating Kashmiri reports and Kashmiri poetry. And I think it's still ongoing, it's still alive somewhere. So I feel like that exchange has happened. It just needs to build. But I also know the forces on the Indian occupied side. India and Israeli settler state, they share so much information. They're doing business together, they're doing tourism, they're doing surveillance, they're doing cyber surveillance. India doesn't need to learn from Israeli settler state, but it is learning some different forms, and they're exchanging information about how to securitize their states. There are also surveillance methods of punishment that are happening on Kashmiris, and then arms and armaments that are coming from that part of the world into Kashmir. So there's a lot of that kind of exchange happening. And I know there is going to be more and more repression, but I also know that there is going to be more and more awareness, because we do have, even if we have compromised and capitalistic tools in hand, I feel like some chink in the armor of this tyrant has happened, and people are talking to each other, and that's my only hope. And so, Suhail, you talk about highlighting issues in the Arab world and dotted with several conflicts. I don't think we should put the trope of Arab world being in conflicts. All the world is in conflicts, and these are also conflicts that are not just conflicts, they're outright wars. I don't see them as just conflicts. It's not as if the societies are inherently conflictual in some ways. These are wars that have been imposed, and these are also a part of the colonization and neocolonialism. So I feel like highlighting issue in Arab world, it is happening. I feel like India at this moment doesn't need help in the way it's unraveling, but we have to do our part. And that part is writing and having conversations in creating awareness. And I know in this moment, as Kashmiris have been silenced, they're not silent, but they have been silenced. People outside have to make sure that they are talking to the rest of the world in the best, most overt political way they can. So that's my only hope there. And then speaking to Shaira's question, I really want to take this question and think about it more, because it's not that Suhail's question was more direct, but this is more like it gives more fodder for thought. And it's a lot to kind of deal with in the less time we have, but talking about non-formal or maybe more non-secular rituals of writing and resistance, I think that is another decolonizing or decolonial move. And that's how we are looking towards a decolonial futures, where we have to archive them, where we have to, like in Sabah Mahmood's work, we see how she projects feminism, the feminist praxis. And that's what we have to do in the kind of writing that is being produced, in the kind of expressions. And that's why I say, I think I already earlier mentioned that I don't really feel the need, like I don't want to think of like milestones that people think about, like when they produce good writing, the Western instituted awards and accolades. I don't think that's what's happening here anymore. I think there are a lot of scholars who are really wedded to understanding their societies in a very decolonial manner and trying to capture those non-secular rituals and forms of writing or expression that are happening, and kind of like formalize them, institutionalize them, and show them to the rest of the world, because that's what we are about. So I know this is like a very fast answer. I could have answered both the questions better, but we don't have time.
No, they were perfect answers. I'm so sorry we have reached the end of our time, but knowing Shaira, I'm sure that she will be, hello Shaira, she'll be so happy to continue the discussion with Ather and with Dalia. So, please do make those connections. That's what is, that's what this event and this series of events is about, keeping the dialogue and the conversation going, not just ending after this event. So I will end us there, and I'm going to hand back to Emma and to Tawfiq to kind of finish off. But thank you both so much for your wonderful contributions and for the wonderful discussion, and also to those who came and asked such brilliant questions that kept our conversation very rich and alive. Thank you.
Indeed. Thank you, Nadine. And thank you to our panelists today, Ather Zia and Dalia Taha, for this incredibly moving and very insightful and brilliant talk. I feel very proud to have been a part of organizing it. So I'd like to thank you sincerely, as well as all those who were in attendance and put forward their questions. You've been listening to the Kashmir Palestine Conversation Series, a series aimed to create spaces for dialogue, network, and knowledge exchange between scholars of both Kashmir and Palestine. I'll hand over now to my colleague, Dr. Emma Brandlund, one of the other founders of this Kashmir Palestine Conversation Series, to be able to speak about forthcoming events and then do the final sign-off. So thank you. Emma?
Yeah, I just want to reiterate what Tawfiq said. Thank you so much, Nadine, Ather, and Dalia. It was a really interesting, really engaging conversation. I think there's a lot of food for thought to take with us from this. I know we're over time, so I just wanted to say that our next event is taking place on the 14th of February. We're going to go back to our previous time, so 3 p.m. UK, 5 p.m. Jerusalem, 8:30 Srinagar time. We have Yael Berda who will speak about her book on incarcerations. And we also have another event on the 15th of March. So those two events will be published on our website, KashmirPalestineScholars.org, in a short while. So just keep an eye on that space. So thank you all for coming. It was really great to have you all here, and looking forward to seeing you at our next event. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Emma. Can I just do a small correction? The event on the February 14th is going to be on colonial bureaucracies and contemporary citizenship between Israel and India today. So she's just come out with a book from Cambridge on the subject, and she specifically takes up these case studies, and so she'll present on that. So as Emma said, check out the website where you'll find information about how to sign up for that. So thank you, and have a great evening.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bless.